Right before the election last November, polling was done as usual, and I was especially intrigued by the way that the poll results showed that younger Americans had a really different orientation toward politics and toward political economy than others. So, for example, 70% of millennials and 64% of the generation after them, so-called Gen Z, said they'd be ready to support a socialist candidate for president. And of course, the great avatar of youthful socialism in our country seems to be Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who calls herself a democratic socialist and sure gets a lot of attention. So today, we're going to be talking about these things, how the younger generation is attracted to socialism. Is it a fatal attraction, and what can be done about it? That's our subject today on our Lighthouse Briefing, coming to you from the Independent Institute here in Oakland, California. I'm Graham Walker, and I welcome everybody who's joined us today. This is, of course, a special briefing for friends and supporters of the Independent Institute. We want to give you kind of a front row seat on some of the things that we're thinking and doing here at Independent Institute, and we're grateful to have you with us. You've been invited if you're a member of our Lighthouse Society, which means that you're a pretty faithful supporter of us. We've invited a few other special friends as well. Thank you for joining us. And as we get going on this today, keep in mind that you can toss your questions into the Q&A or the chat box, or you can raise your hand on the Zoom feature, and in a little bit we'll take your questions live and in person. But first of all, if we're going to talk about younger Americans and what I'm calling the fatal attraction of socialism, we need to talk to some younger Americans. So today, I've got two examples, sterling examples of the younger generations who are probably a little bit of an exception to the rule. First of all, let me welcome Chloe Anagnos, who is our Director of Marketing here at Independent Institute. Welcome, Chloe.
Thank you so much for having me, Graham. I'm excited.
And you're coming to us long distance. You're where today?
I am in sunny Indianapolis, Indiana.
Okay, yeah, long ways out. We have quite, a team of people around the country, and we're delighted to have welcomed Chloe recently to be our Director of Marketing. Chloe graduated from Ball State University in Indiana in 2015, which I think makes you a member of the so-called Millennial generation, if I'm not mistaken. Is that right?
I am, yes.
Okay, a proud representative of your generation? Well, we'll see. So, and then other guest, I'm pleased to welcome Jonathan Hofer, who is a research associate here at the Independent Institute. He works with us here in our Oakland office, and that's where you are today, right, Jonathan?
I am, yes.
So glad to have you, Jonathan. Glad to have you talking today with all of our friends, as well as working for us regularly on a lot of the important stuff that we research and produce. So you graduated from UC Berkeley when?
I graduated in 2019.
Oh, so not very long ago. So I think that makes you a member of Gen Z by the usual definitions.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Some of them are younger than you and are still Gen Z, and some of them are older than you and are millennial. But anyway, I guess you're just Gen Z.
Yeah.
Something like that. Okay. Thank you very much for joining us. So this should be fun. One of the things that really seemed weird to me is that when I looked at this polling data over the past, year, and saw that, as I said, 70% of millennials and 64% of the younger Gen Z group would support a socialist candidate. That was kind of striking, especially compared to 36% of the baby boomers. So I probably qualify as a baby boomer, young as I look. And I thought supposedly the baby boomers had been like the first really progressive, woke generation, anti-war marches and all that stuff. But actually, 36% favor socialism versus 70% of millennials. That's a huge, huge difference. At the same time, I saw some other polling more recently indicating that trust in government also varies generationally. And so, listen to this, and I need one of you to make sense of this for me, and then we'll go further, but just as a starting point, help me figure this out. So how can it be that 70% of millennials say that they would, favor socialism or a socialist candidate, but only 6% of millennials say that they have trust in government? What does that mean? Either of you want to take a stab at that? They don't trust the government, but they want to give the government control of everything.
I think, Graham, that just kind of goes back to the fact that millennials and Gen Z, they don't understand what socialism is, and they don't understand the government's role in carrying out socialism. And I'll give you a really good example. I was at a wedding this past summer, and one of the wedding guests sitting next to me was talking about how he was a socialist and how wonderful working together in a commune would be, and was just really advocating for it. And when I brought up the fact that, well, what if I did not want to join your commune? How would you handle that? And he said, well, you would just have to. That's just how it would work.
Oh,
And I said, well, if I don't, who would you get to drag me into your commune and take all of my things? It would have to be the government. So I think so many young people have this idea of rainbows and butterflies and communes and doing everything for the greater good of mankind, but they don't understand that when someone doesn't comply, that's when the government comes in. And I think that is one thing that older generations have seen, especially if you remember the Cold War, if you remember communism, why we went and fought in Vietnam and Korea. You understand that communism, socialism is bad, but if you were born after 91, after the fall of the wall, you probably don't quite understand.
Right. It's a dimmer
all
memory.
the bad things. It is a very different memory. And I think you could even argue that with anyone who was born after 9/11, is that they just have no concept of the Cold War or the threat of communism, the threat of socialism from, the USSR, from Vietnam, from North Korea. So I think that's where some of it comes in. But Jonathan, maybe I'm wrong. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there is definitely a segment of people that they don't trust their government precisely because it's not socialist enough. But I agree
interesting.
that the larger portion of people who are answering in that manner, I don't believe truly understand socialism. And one of the reasons why I think that is because if you look at a lot of these studies, and there's a number of these studies that are showing trends in attitudes towards socialism, the questions are not really about nationalizing heavy industry. They're not about what Lenin called the commanding heights. It's not about a single party system. Frequently, what you're getting with these surveys are things like, do you support subsidized education, food stamps? Do you think that there's too much wealth inequality? Do you have negative opinions towards the top 1% of wealth earners? And those don't necessarily comport to the school of old school socialist thought. So I think there's a cultural disconnect between young survey respondents and older generations on what their ideas of socialism actually mean. And you see that also with the candidacy of Bernie Sanders. One of the big questions in a lot of polling was that, do you or would you vote for Bernie Sanders? And younger people compared to older generations are more likely to vote for Bernie Sanders, but that does not therefore mean that they are in fact hoping for some Marxist utopia. So I think it is useful that these surveys are monitoring this. It's definitely not irrelevant data.
You know what's funny about the Bernie Sanders part, though, is that while it is true that younger Americans were not alive and don't have a living memory of the Cold War period, and didn't see the people lined up for toilet paper for half a day and so forth in Moscow, and weren't aware of the depredations of Chinese communism, didn't see the Cultural Revolution and the deaths there and so forth. Nevertheless, Bernie Sanders did. When Bernie Sanders says, I'm a socialist, Bernie Sanders doesn't have that particular excuse for what does socialism in practice actually mean. Bernie Sanders knows what it means, but those who support Bernie Sanders don't. So that's a very interesting disconnect. One fears that if the younger voters succeeded in electing a Bernie Sanders, and we may be getting a Bernie Sanders light right now, that they don't really know what they're buying.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things is that a lot of historians have looked into socialist movements in the early United States. So roughly 1840s to about the 1920s. And the United States never really had as big of a revolution as you saw in Western Europe. And by revolution, I mean, at the very least, attempted revolutions. And one of the conclusions that many historians have come across with is that the United States never really had much of a stratified economy where it's the bourgeoisie versus the proletariat. because our liberalized market economy allowed for a lot of upward social mobility.
Right.
So
everyone in America had a shot at moving up, and that's why there wasn't a big class antagonism.
Yeah, you didn't have much of a Marxist movement because capitalism was so successful. Later on, after a lot of early progressive era reforms, you do see some socialist movements in the United States, but that's not until the early 1900s, and Debs would be the notable example.
Eugene Debs, right?
So I think one of the reasons why younger people might be predisposed to socialism relative to, let's say, the baby boomer or even Gen X generation is that you have less capitalism, which therefore leads to less upward social mobility. Mm-hmm. You didn't have the stratified international arrangement between the USSR and the First World. Mm-hmm. And we grew up during the 2008 housing crisis. So you're looking at the economy and economic and financial news, and you see everything's broken. And
so as American capitalism became less capitalist, it became less fluid in terms of class mobility and less successful in terms of generating consistent wealth. So less capitalism, less success generates more anti-capitalism.
Precisely.
Now there's a disconnect there going on. But that's because people don't realize that, in fact, American free exchange and free market activities have been more circumscribed than ever before. So, for example, the 2008 crisis. Did the 2008 recession beginning then was started with the housing implosion? Was that the result of an unfettered free market economy?
Oh, most certainly not.
No.
There's excellent economic literature that shows the role of the federal government and the Federal Reserve contributing to the housing crisis. Deregulation played no role. Despite what you may have seen on the Democratic presidential debates, things like Glass-Steagall had virtually no consequence on the failure of investment banks. It didn't even pertain to most of the investment banks that actually went belly up. It was mostly regulating commercial banks.
Right. So less capitalism, less economic success, more hostility to capitalism. Chloe, you had a comment on this 2008 recession thing. I think I missed you a moment ago.
Oh, no worries. Well, it's funny that we're talking about this because I'm originally from Elkhart, Indiana, which had the highest unemployment rate in the country during the 2008 housing crisis. And one of the things that was so funny about the Obama administration coming in to fix the problem was the amount of quantitative easing that they did in trying to invest into infrastructure, invest into schools, and invest a lot of government money into Elkhart, Indiana. And I can tell you almost, 12 to 13, 15 years later, none of it really helped and none of it really worked.
Right.
And so one of the recurring themes that I think people will hear us talking about in this conversation and at the Independent Institute is that when government comes in and tries to help, they're usually doing the exact opposite. And that's really what we saw, at least in my neck of the woods in 2008 and in other parts of the country too. And something, and Jonathan, I think you have mentioned this before as well, but when young people talk about how horrible capitalism is, they're actually talking about cronyism.
Right.
And I think that's a huge disservice, disservice in that this generation has this idea that, well, capitalism is bad and capitalism causes, homelessness and excess and all of these huge problems in our society, when they're really talking about cronyism, but for whatever reason, they just can't understand the difference between the two.
Yeah.
Or maybe they just don't want to realize that there is a difference between the two and that capitalism saves people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, to be generous to people who have that misgiving or misunderstanding, after all, it is not uncommon for those in business to look for opportunities to improve their market position at the expense of others by gaining governmental favors, by trying to exploit special privileges or government-conferred market advantages. And when those who are undertaking the free exchange system themselves try and grab benefits that are not that are only pertinent really to the socialist model, it discredits, the free model. Business people in America, turns out, can't reliably be counted upon to support, advocate, and practice the model of actually non-governmental free exchange. They're like all human beings, they're looking for advantages, and government is the biggest advantage. It's the biggest plum. If you can grab the government and get your market position in your industry, boy, you're going to profit. And there's just enough of that it discredits the general idea, especially because that flies below the radar.
Precisely. Right. One of my favorite political scientists was George Stigler. Split his time between political science and economics. And he has one of the greatest papers. He coined the term regulatory capture. And
oh, yeah. Good
so
term.
If you ask people their opinions on potential presidential or Senate candidates, the candidates' opinions on things like intellectual property laws, commercial versus investment banking functions, and how that's split up, people don't really have an opinion, in part because they simply don't have the knowledge, or they might not be aware that that might be a problem. But the concentrated interests that have the ability to profit off those are small. And so lobbying efforts are wildly successful to get regulations changed in your favor because you don't have any opponents. No one's choosing their presidential candidate based on their opinions on some niche intellectual property law.
Right.
So now the thing is that doesn't mean that private enterprise is inherently wrong. It just means that the government power to regulate market functions needs to be weaker so that people can't game the system.
Exactly. Because if government power exists, it can be captured. But if a power doesn't exist, if it hasn't been created, then it can't be captured. Which seems very straightforward, but most people don't seem to notice that. Okay, so let me just pause for a second here. We've got a whole bunch of our friends from around the country on the call with us right now, and some of them have been offering me questions in writing. Let me also remind you, if you're with us as a participant today, that this is a closed webinar, and so you can, if you wish, open your mic, and I'll open it up then, to be heard. You raise your hand in the chat, in the participant panel, press the raise my hand thing, and also at the bottom of your screen. I'll see the raised hand. I'll open your mic. You can speak your question to Chloe or Jonathan. But in the meanwhile, while I'm waiting for you all to start raising your hand to open the mic, I've got a great question that was typed up and sent in by Jane, who's on the line, who says, younger Americans clearly have no idea what socialism actually means, that it's a type of economic organization which all productive resources are owned and micromanaged by a government. They have no historical background, like I guess Jonathan was saying. They have no historical background, apparently, just like the sound of the word socialism, because it reminds them of something else. They know about social media. This is Jane talking. She says they know about social media, use it extensively, and love it. If social media are desirable, then something that sounds like it must be equally desirable. After all, the only difference between socialism and social is a three-letter suffix. So Jane's question, is younger Americans' attraction to socialism simply their confusion between two words? That sounds too simple. Comments from either of you to Jane's question. Good question, Jane.
Yeah, and I think it's a really good question. Go ahead, Jonathan. I was just
going to say, I agree with the first part. I don't think younger people fully understand what socialism is. So I think that does contribute to a lot of confusion.
Yeah, no doubt. And another thing that comes to my mind as we talk about this, and Jane's observation about the term, the adjective social, and your observation earlier, one of you, about how people, they want to support policies that help people. Here, this seems to be like a standard opinion, person in the street, previously called man in the street, but now we call him person in the street. So the adage goes something like this: if you care about other people, then you're probably a socialist. If you don't care about other people, you're probably a capitalist. Now, that's a very brutal reduction of the ideas, but it's pretty common. It's pretty common. Like younger people, I'll speak to the two of you. One of the things that makes younger people attractive is that they do care. They do have passion, and you're alive to the ideal of being benevolent toward your fellow man. I love that about younger people. It's why I've been a college professor for years myself. And that quality needs to be cultivated even among all of us, including the older generation. But there's a kind of subtlety involved in here because it's true that the economic analysis of the free exchange system we call capitalism does depend upon recognizing that profit seeking is an important motive force in the development of the provision of goods and services. And if people couldn't make a profit, then they wouldn't pursue as much of the economically helpful economic activity. So the desire to provide for yourself and to advance yourself is harnessed by a system of free exchange in a way that generates more economic activity and more wealth that's better for everybody. So that desire to advance yourself is good. But then it needs to be contained within a system of freedom, of principles of freedom. So like the crony capitalist who wants to advance himself, he needs to see that the best way to advance himself is not to grab a government benefit, but to actually generate as many goods and services at the lowest price so that he'll do better himself. So it's true that the capitalist system does harness self-interest. But what actually happens in a truly capitalist system is that it harnesses the motive of self-interest in a way that generates an outcome that benefits the common good. Whereas socialism, as portrayed by many of its advocates and theorists, is allegedly about wanting to really operationalize the desire to help other people. And if you want to help other people, then you want to get the government to help other people. Well, the trouble with that is that it doesn't actually work that way. That if you want to help other people, then what you want to do is create a system that harnesses self-interest. So if you're a selfless person, if you're altruistic, then you should want a system that harnesses self-interest, if you understand how the world works. But many people don't. They just imagine, well, if I'm selfless and I want to help other people, then the government should help other people too. And the government goes about doing it. The government gets powers. The government squelches economic activity. The poor get poorer and poorer. The political class gets more and more powerful. And the desire to do good produces the worst possible harm. So there's a lot of paradoxical mechanisms that work in human society that the simple equation of selfishness with capitalism just doesn't capture.
I think one of the easiest ways to explain that, Graham, is to, when you're talking with young people, I also like to say, okay, let's say you pay $20,000 a year in taxes all together, federal, state, income, whatever. At the end of the year, would you rather give that $10,000 or $20,000 to the government? Would you rather keep it for yourself, or would you rather give it to a charity, church, synagogue, whatever of your choosing? Most people will tell me that they'd rather keep it themselves, or they divide it up between themselves and charity.
Exactly, those two.
And when I ask them, well, why wouldn't you give it to the government? Because what I'm talking about is the amount you pay in taxes every year. They say, well, I don't know where it goes. Okay, then why would you advocate for raising taxes when you know that the government is not going to, for example, education is huge in Indiana, referendums like crazy the last couple of legislative cycles. Would you rather just give that cash donation to your local school or your local library because you know how they're going to utilize it and they can utilize it as they see fit? Or would you rather give it to your local greedy government and have them use it on some type of administration fee that's not really going to help someone? So I think sometimes you really have to make the language as if you're talking to a third or fourth grader, as unfortunate as that is.
That's not very flattering.
It's not very flattering, but at the same time, I've found that you have to really take a lot of these complex questions and boil them down and boil down these ideas so that the average person can understand. And so that maybe they can vote a little bit smarter or kind of come over to our side, which is the liberty side.
You know, here's another, you mentioned education. Here's another kind of example of that phenomenon is that I did an interview 2 days ago with James Tooley, who is the author of this great book that Independent Institute just published. It's called Really Good Schools, Global Lessons for High Caliber, Low Cost Education. I advise you to get the book. In my interview with Dr. Tooley, who is a British scholar, worked a lot in India and Africa, he discovered all these non-governmental schools thriving in the poorest neighborhoods around the world, with millions of students being educated. And what makes many of them tick is the fact that some people figure out in really poor neighborhoods that if they get together some children and they get together some people who can teach them some basic things and they charge a fee that's just enough, they can actually make a living and sponsor a school which means that these schools are growing and growing and growing, and more and more poor children are getting educated because it's just possible to make enough margin on the opening of these private schools to float your own family as well as providing a service to others. And so it harnesses self-interest in a way that fantastically promotes the common good, compared to government schools where, of course, the schools are not accountable to the parents. They're accountable to some government bureaucrat somewhere in a distant place. And government schools in the third world or the global south are notoriously unresponsive to parents and do a terrible job of educating their children. So harnessing private interest for the common good is what is the miracle of the system of freedom. And those who want to just go straight to the common good without going through, private property and free markets, the consequences are not what they intend. So let me just switch gears. I don't want to miss a couple of these other questions. Here's a question that I also got from somebody. When are most millennials or Gen Z exposed to socialist ideas? Like, when does this happen? Chloe, comment on that?
I would say most of it happens, unfortunately, Graham, kind of like what you mentioned. I think it happens in schools. And I think because of COVID, we're seeing more and more children being indoctrinated with some of these ideas like critical race theory. Everybody gets a participation trophy. That was the big thing in the 90s when I was growing up, which I think really affected self-esteem, inflated sense of self. And so I think a lot of these principles start at a younger and younger age. And of course, when you get to university, it just becomes all that much more worse. And Jonathan, I think you went to, remind me where you graduated. And I think that's where a lot of some of these ideas are starting to fester. We're at your undergrad. Am I right?
Yeah,
Berkeley.
I went to University of California, Berkeley. Yeah, I think children are exposed to socialist ideas quite young. Depending on how broad you want to get with what is included in the basket of socialism, at the very least, children are going to public schools, public preschools at 4 or 5 years old. And I think a lot of the curriculum has really tended towards a lot of Marxist ideas. A few years ago, the 1619 Project was a Pulitzer Prize winning piece, and that has influenced a lot of historical revisionism. And for those who don't know, a big part of that project is looking at American history through the lens of sort of minority groups similar to Howard Zinn's People of History. But the distinction is that it's critical of capitalism in the sense that the success of the United States is attributable to the exploitation of those minorities. So I believe as a student who's listening to that sort of thing, you're very, it would paint a very negative picture of capitalism because you're sitting in class and you're being told that the only way that people are getting ahead and the only reason that the United States is wealthy is because it was built off of the backs of slaves and only slaves, and everything was stolen and exploited from other people.
That's what you're told, not being told at the same time that the powers exercised improperly over various minority groups by dominant groups were very typically governmentally reinforced powers, and that in fact what enabled immigrants and others, minority groups in the U.S. to rise so dramatically is the system of freedom, whereby they could get a stake in private property and advance themselves. It's a kind of turning the narrative of history upside down and using Marxist categories to superimpose it upon the U.S. experience. Oh, here's a question coming in from one of our participants. Bill says, how does the youthful flirtation with socialism translate into support for BLM and Antifa? Have our colleges succeeded in teaching that America is evil and its sins can never be expiated? So, Jonathan, you were talking about this. I think the key question that Bill's point is that have they succeeded in completely overwhelming the consciousness of younger Americans about what makes America tick?
They've definitely made their grounds in being a large influence on our thought. I think there's a direct connection between things like BLM and Antifa and old school Marxist thought, at the very least, Marxism traditionally posits a class conflict theory.
Right.
So
everything can be explained through that.
Yeah, so traditionally it was on socioeconomic grounds, the bourgeoisie versus proletariat, but you can very easily substitute a different class conflict theory, and one of those can be police versus minorities. So it's a similar format, you're still interpreting it through the same lens, and organizations like BLM, and to clarify, I know that there's a greater movement referred to in the colloquial sense as Black Lives Matter, but the organization itself, the organizers have explicitly stated that they have Marxist political views.
Yeah, I am a trained Marxist, one of the co-founders said.
Yeah,
that seemed pretty plain.
That's scary. And that's very scary. And it's funny, Graham and Jonathan, I don't know if you saw this, but I think it came out recently that either one of the founders or the founder of the movement Black Lives Matter owns like a couple different mansions. I mean, it's a very, very well off
multi-million-dollar homes and so forth.
Multi-million-dollar home. And it's just so hilarious that when you look at, the bourgeoisie in the USSR and in France and throughout history, it's always the people at the top who have the most, the Marxists coming in and trying to say, oh, well, it's you versus the oppressor. It's the oppressed versus the oppressor. And that's now, I think we're definitely starting to see with critical race theory trying to get, leaked into our public schools, into our public universities.
What can be done, of course, is a natural question. I would say that one of our participants, Nancy and Dick made a comment. Listening to the Chloe and Jonathan gives me hope for our younger generation. Thank you, guys. So that's a comment coming to you as we speak. And then here's the next question from someone named David. What can we do to counteract? Okay, that was the question I was posing. What can be done? Now, obviously, Independent Institute, we're on the forefront of this because we've gotten 35.5 million views, combined views of our incredible video series, LoveGov, which is kind of a parody takedown of big government socialist policies. That's, I think, a great contribution to the effort. What else do you guys think can be done to sort of resist this brainwashing or propaganda or whatever it is in your generation?
Well, I think you stumped us.
No, go ahead.
I think from my perspective and in my role as director of marketing is trying to figure out ways to kind of like what I said, take these bite-sized ideas and explain them in ways that make sense to maybe someone who's never been exposed to liberty, to freedom-ish type ideas. And so that's a day-to-day concept that our marketing team at the Independent Institute has been working towards, finding different forms of media, like social media, for example, making sure that we're in places like Instagram, where these younger folks tend to be on the internet, so that we can hopefully reel them in and get them to be on our side. I think that's definitely day to day one thing that we're doing. But I would tell anyone who's a supporter of ours to, of course, share our information on your social media and share it with people that that are millennials or Gen Z. But I also think a lot of it comes to a local level of making sure, whether it's the way that you vote or if it's talking to elected officials, about keeping critical race theory out of your public school system.
Right. I know that's really important.
Very important. And I think it comes as a state by state basis too, but I think that's probably the biggest challenge we're going to face in terms of education in the next couple of years. So those are just kind of my thoughts.
I want to make an observation that Jonathan, I'll let you respond to this in a second, Jonathan. My thought is that breadth of knowledge is actually a really good antidote to actually know the facts. So I have a theory. Tell me if this is true, Jonathan. I have a theory that in some ways the prevalence of this kind of socialist or quasi-socialist thinking and propaganda at sort of the mid to lower range of American higher education may be more worrisome than at the top range. Is it true, for example, that maybe in the Ivy League or at Cal Berkeley there's more space to question these things, or do you think it's worse at the top of the pecking order in higher ed?
I would actually agree with the former. I think you have much more dialogue at the upper levels of higher education. Um, and that's partly just the dynamic of how these things are taught. If you're in a high school class and you're being
Right,
instructed
right.
about like critical theories or Frankfurt School ideas and whatnot, um, the teacher is presenting this as truth or evidently correct. Whereas in a university setting, especially at higher divisions or even post-grad, um, it's a little more one-on-one and there's more of
Hmm.
a dialogue. So I think just the format of that creates a different dynamic.
Yeah. So, for example, some people listening to us and shaking their head and agreeing with us may feel that education is the enemy. Well, I mean, the education establishment may be the problem, but actual learning is not the enemy. Knowledge is our friend, not our enemy. And the more you understand about the dynamics of human societies and political economy, the less likely you are to be persuaded by the socialist argument. So I say more knowledge, more learning is actually the solution, rather than keeping, like people say, well, I'm not going to send my kid to college because they're going to get exposed to all this trash, a sentiment that I share. But the way to do it is to make sure that your young person, your son or daughter, if you have sons and daughters, maybe some of you have grandchildren, that they actually read broadly and widely, and not just a narrow book list out of some liberal professor, but a book list that goes beyond, that has some of the greatest works on the subject of political economy and public morals, for example, that our civilization has produced. Book lists are really good. Jonathan, do we have any book lists?
We produce them at the Independent Institute. You can find it under the Issues tab in Recommended Reading. We have one on socialism and education. The education one's at the top of the page, the socialism one's at the bottom. But going back to that previous point, it's very important to have a good message because, of course, it boils down to we have to get the message out.
Right.
But I think a lot of messaging tends to fall under the category of just saying that socialism is bad and that it doesn't work.
That's not helpful.
And that's not especially helpful.
Right, right.
We really need to make sense of what people are seeing themselves and give a better reason why that's happening. And I think with a lot of millennials and Gen Z, especially after the '08 housing crisis, wages are pretty stagnant, purchasing power is quite poor,
Mm-hmm.
employment fluctuates. We need to have a better message of why that happens, because right now the prevailing message is that the game's rigged, and it's rigged by the wealthy to exploit the poor. And so Marxism is kind of attractive if you have that frame of mind. However, if you know that like government is an immutable part of the process of the those in power exploiting those without power, then you can have a better. It's more easier to contend with what you're up against.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it kind of goes back to what we were saying before. If we don't create mechanisms of government control, then they can't be captured by private interests and misused. It's kind of a principle. I just want to remind our participants, we're going to come to a close here in about 5 minutes, but some of you might want to speak your questions aloud. And if you do, please just say, raise your hand. You press the button at the bottom, and I will open the mic for you. In the meanwhile, I just wanted to comment on one other angle on this that Jonathan mentioned to me earlier. I think that there are interesting connections and disconnections between religious belief among millennials and Gen Z and how this might translate into their political views on socialism. You had some comments on that angle, didn't you, Jonathan? Religious belief and the
too. So surveys of millennials and Gen Z tend to show that relative to previous generations, Gen Z are becoming much more irreligious. They cite that church is less important to them. More than double the amount of millennials, or Gen Z are twice as likely than millennials to report that they're atheist, and fewer are going to church. And I think that has an interesting interaction with the prevalence of progressivism. I think Well, it's interesting because in school, we generally isolate the progressive era to the early 19th century, but I think it's so prevalent that this affects religious beliefs in some
Mm-hmm.
fashion. And I
Mm-hmm.
believe that progressivism, as many contemporary political commentators have noted, does have religious tropes to it that
It
people
does.
find attractive.
Mm-hmm.
And I would agree with this idea. And I would say specifically, progressivism has a lot of influence from Puritan Christianity. And you can see this in the early progressive movement, especially with temperance, pornography prohibitions in New York, especially with the Nickelodeons, um, even a little bit during the Second Great Awakening. And I think there's a tendency to outsource a lot of the traditional church functions
Mm-hmm.
to the government
Mm-hmm.
because progressivism has co-opted certain elements of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
And those traditional things would be like care for the poor,
Mm-hmm.
orphanages, caretaking for widows. Those were traditionally things that the church did. And because progressivism co-opted a lot of that, and because Gen Z are becoming more secular, uh, I think Gen Z are much more likely to believe that those are things that are roles for the state and not for religious organizations.
Mm-hmm. Or private parties of other kinds too. Chloe, feel free to jump in at any point here if you want to
Oh, yeah,
comment.
absolutely. And I think it's so funny that you look at socialism, communism, you look at how religion in communist countries like China is banned for the most part. Christians, I mean,
Except underground, it's percolating.
yeah, it percolates underground, but it's so sad because you have Christians who are ostracized, Muslims, of course, in China. The same thing happens there. In Cuba, I mean, we can go into many different stories about how folks who are religious are persecuted in those types of countries. But in addition to religion being something that is kind of frowned upon or is just not practiced as much, it kind of goes into the family unit as well, and how
Mm-hmm.
family units, the traditional family unit, is not something that progressives, socialists look at either. But of course, I know we're coming close on time, and we can obviously talk about this for
Oh
hours.
man, yeah, we could go. That's a really interesting point, though, Chloe. I mean, to the degree that fewer and fewer Americans have, their early life in a context of a family with a mother and father and some stability, that leads to instability, in personality. It shows, evidence shows that people from single-parent families, or worse, who don't have intact families at all, they just do more poorly economically and so forth. And thus, if families are disintegrating, not just religion or churches, but families, as you say, then that leaves people feeling even more fragile and thus even more vulnerable to the need for a powerful paternalistic state. We need so much more than mere freedom for freedom to work. We need functional human beings who are healthy. We need all these things. One thing that I wanted to comment on, coming back to Jonathan, is that another angle on religion is that the religious dimension of progressivism, or forms of socialism, it has a psychological element as well, which is that it's a vehicle for the aspirations of the soul. That's what I would call them: the yearning to benefit others, to see a transcendent meaning realized in the world. And those spiritual aspirations, they don't disappear when the churches, when people don't go to church. The aspirations are still there in the human soul. They have a tendency to attach themselves to an object. I mean, according to the religions of historic Western civilization, God is the proper object for those aspirations and those passions of the soul. But if God isn't in the picture, those passions are going to be attached elsewhere, probably to some vision of the future given by socialist advocates or others. And so there's a powerful spiritual psychology at work whereby people seek meaning and fulfillment by advocating socialism or other things, when really all those other gods are going to fail them, and the idea that somehow if we want to do good and we set up government to do good, that good is going to be done, it's just an incredibly simplistic way of thinking about it that will disappoint in the long run. So we are going to close off here in just a second. I'm thanking all of our participants, been sending me interesting comments. I'm going to just run through a few of them just so you know that I heard you, even though we ran out of time. How about a course in civics in secondary school? Would that solve the problem? Are others doing anything besides Independent Institute to solve these problems? Yes, others are. I think ours are among the most potent, but others definitely are. What about, here's another nice comment. Very refreshing to listen to bright young minds again. Thank you. We appreciate all that. And also kind of in closing here, we were talking with Jonathan a moment ago about how we have reading lists, book lists. So let me just show you something. You can go to the Independent Institute homepage, which is this, and hopefully everybody who's on this call is very familiar with this homepage. And you said, Jonathan, we should go to Issues right here, and then go to Recommended Readings. And here you've got a whole series of fabulous book lists. These are on education, civil rights, anti-Semitism, poverty, and the welfare state. This is especially good. And then here's this great list, recommended readings on the folly of socialism, what everyone should know about the practical and moral failures of the socialist project. Okay, you want resources to share with your family, your children, your grandchildren? Send them to the Independent Institute, to this Issues tab, to these recommended readings. We've got a lot of good stuff for you. Have them read LoveGov, watch LoveGov, of course. Have them read our Catalyst blog, which is oriented toward younger readers. We've got a lot of materials that we have assembled. The reason we exist is to try and reinforce Americans and to give them the resources needed to resist these bad ideas, socialism among them, and to give them the evidence for freedom. So with all that said, Chloe, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's really a pleasure, and you can tell that our friends on the call have appreciated your input. Jonathan, thank you too.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
And I know that all of our friends are basically saying here, keep up the good work, Chloe and Jonathan, and thank you for giving all of us the resources we need to help in this battle for the mind and for freedom. So keep in touch with us, friends. Thank you for being part of our Lighthouse Society. If you are a member, I encourage you to continue your support for us. We do need your support to keep doing all these good things. You can go to that same homepage, upper right corner, I think is the donate button. I don't want to overemphasize that, but we do need your help and are grateful for it. Please join us next time, too, when we probably next month sometime, we will probably have another Lighthouse Briefing call for our friends around the country and around the world. From the Independent Institute, goodbye and take care.